"Then stay and be my wife," said the gruff mountain trapper, after the runaway bride dragged him out of the frozen river. The ice gave under me before I heard it crack. 1 second I was crossing Harlan's Ford. Same crossing I'd used for 11 years. Same 3-foot shelf of snow-packed granite to my left. Same deadfall ash on the far bank. And the next seconds, the whole sheet tilted and I was in. The Blackthorn River up to my chest with the cold hitting me like a wall of iron. My right arm shot out and caught the broken edge. Held. The weight of the pack and the rifle across my back pulled. The edge didn't hold. I went under. I want to say I fought it. I did some. My boots found nothing. The current under the ice was slow, but it was sure, and the cold had already taken my hands. I didn't feel them anymore. 2 dead ends at the bottom of my wrists. I managed to get my face near a pocket of air, breathed. Moved another few feet downstream in the dark and the cold and the pressing weight of the ice above me. Found another air pocket, smaller. You start thinking strange things when you're dying cold. I thought about the 2 mink pelts I'd left at the cache near Widow's Creek that I'd never, now go back for. I thought about the fire I hadn't built that morning because I figured I'd make Corbin's Landing by midday and warm up there, and how that decision was going to kill me just as sure as if I'd put a gun to my own head. I thought about 43 years and what they'd amounted to, and the answer that came back was, not a great deal. A trapline. 1-room cabin that leaked in 3 places. A name, Walt Decker, that nobody was going to miss saying. I stopped moving my legs, because I gave up, exactly, more because there was nothing left to give. Then something grabbed my coat, both hands. Hard, not careful about it. She got hold of my collar, with one fist, and the back of my coat with the other, and she pulled, and I felt the ice edge scrape my chest, and then my face was in cold air, and I was coughing river water onto snow. I didn't see her at first. I was face down, trying to remember how to breathe, and she was still pulling, dragging me by the coat across the snow, away from the water like I was a calf she was pulling out of a mud hole. I outweighed her by 80 pounds. Didn't seem to matter to her. She got me 5 feet from the edge, and then she stopped pulling, and she stood over me and said, "Don't you die." I did not come all this way to watch a man die in a river. I rolled onto my back. She was wearing a white dress. Or it had been white. It was gray with river water and mud now, and the bottom foot of it was soaked through, and there was a tear in the left shoulder, where something had caught it. Dark hair, most of it loose from whatever it had been pinned into. No coat. No coat. It was 12 degrees, I said. "You're freezing," she said. "So are you. Get up." I got up. Took 3 tries. She'd already found a stand of spruce, maybe 40 yards from the water, and she was breaking branches by the time I got to her. Small dead stuff from the undersides, the dry wood that doesn't rot even under snow. She had a fire going in 6 minutes. I couldn't have done it. My hands were still not entirely mine. I sat close enough to the fire that it probably wasn't smart, and I watched her. She stood at the edge of the firelight and wrung out the bottom of the dress with both hands. Methodically, the way you wring out a work shirt. It out, smoothed it down, looked at the fire. "Where's your coat?" I said. "I left it." "Left it where?" "In Grattan." Grattan was 16 miles back over the pass. I didn't say anything for a while. She sat down across the fire from me, tucked her feet underneath herself, and held her hands toward the heat. I asked her name. She said Nora. I said, "Where were you going, Nora? In a white dress and no coat in December?" She looked at me across the fire with steady dark eyes and said, "Away." That was all she said about it, that night. My name is Walt Decker, and I have lived in the Bitterroot Range for the better part of 20 years. Before that, I was from a place in Missouri that I don't talk about. I came up here for the trapping, and I stayed because it suited me. The quiet suited me. The way the mountains don't care what you've done or who you were. They just sit there and let the weather come. I had enough to eat most winters. I had good hands for the trade. I had no particular need for anyone. Or so I'd told myself long enough that I'd stopped checking whether it was true. I was 43 years old when I fell through the ice of the Blackthorn River, and up until that moment I had considered 43 a reasonable age to be close to done. The cabin was 4 miles from where we'd built the fire, and we walked it in the dark. Her beside me, both of us still half wet and moving fast to stay warm. She didn't complain once. I had one hand near frozen and she offered her arm and I took it, and we walked like that. her steadying me where the path dropped away into rock. I should have been embarrassed. I wasn't. I was too cold to manage embarrassment. We went to the beach. I lit the stove, and she found the blankets herself. She just opened the chest by the wall and took them out without asking, which I noticed. And she wrapped one around herself and handed me one, and sat on the edge of the bunk and looked at the stove. I made coffee. My hands were working again by then, mostly. She drank the coffee. And she didn't ask questions about the cabin or the gear or the stacks of pelts, and Corner and I didn't ask questions about the dress or gratin or what she was running from. We sat with the stove ticking and the wind moving against the roof, and I kept thinking, she's going to need somewhere to go. And I kept thinking, that's not your problem, Walt. Except she dragged me out of a frozen river in a white dress. That makes something your problem, I think. Something. Anyway, after a while she said, your hand's bad. I looked at it. 2 of the fingers on my right hand had gone a color they shouldn't be. She said, come here. And when I didn't move, she said it again, less like a request. Went and sat across from her, and she took my hand in both of hers and started working the fingers, pressing the flesh back toward living. It hurt. I didn't say that. She worked steadily and without fuss, rubbing warmth into each finger like it was a job she'd done before, and she probably had. She had that quality, that knowing how quality, like her hands had done difficult things and remembered. You're a nurse, I said. My mother was, she said. She taught me. She kept working my hand. What were you? I asked. She didn't answer right away. Then she said, almost a wife. I looked at her. She didn't look up from my hand. His name was Colbert Vance, she said. He owns most of Grattan County. He's 61 and he smells like bay rum and whiskey, and he told my father the marriage would settle the banknote on the farm. She pressed into the joint of my middle finger, and I made a noise. I wore the dress to the church. I walked down the aisle, as far as when the preacher asked if there were any objections. I did, she said. I said yes, I object. I object to all of it. She set my hand down on her knee, still wrapped in hers, and looked up at me for the first time in a while. Then I ran. I looked at her for a moment. Then I said, in the dress, 16 miles over a mountain pass. I did stop and walk some of it, she said. Something happened in my chest that I can't quite name. It wasn't a laugh exactly. It was something older and ruster than a laugh, something that hadn't moved in a long time, and it moved. She looked at me when it happened, and there was the edge of something in her face. Not a smile yet, but the shape of one that might come. She slept in the bunk, took the floor with a blanket and my coat over me, and I lay there and listened to the stove and the wind, and I thought, by morning, she'll want to know the nearest town with a stage road. She'll want to know how far to the next settlement, whether there's a woman she could board with, what work there might be. She'd figure out what to do next, and she'd do it. I could see that much already. She was the kind of person who figured out what to do next. I thought about how I was going to sleep on this floor alone again, the night after, and the night after that. I hadn't thought about being alone in a long time. You stop feeling it so much eventually, is what I told myself. You get used to the particular shape of quiet that lives in a one-man cabin in the mountains in winter. You stop expecting it to change. She'd grabbed my coat, both hands hard. I looked at the dark ceiling for a while. In the morning, I made biscuits and she made them better. She watched me for about 30 seconds, and then said, let me, and took the pan and her, and they were better. We ate by the stove, and I told her the stage road was at Corbin's Landing, which was the direction I'd been headed when the river took me, and that it was 11 miles. She ate the rest of her biscuit. What's the road to? She asked. North goes to Millhaven, south goes to Fort Pryor. Either one bigger than Grattan? Millhaven's bigger. Pryor's smaller, but there's a freight company there, couple of stores. She was quiet, picked up her coffee. I said, Millhaven would have more work, she said. What kind of work does a woman find in Millhaven? I said laundry, cooking, tending the hotel. There's a doctor there, Aldrich. He might want someone with nursing knowledge. I paused. School. The school teacher left last fall. She sat with all of this for a moment. I stood up and went to the window. 4 inches of new snow had come down in the night. The spruce trees were heavy with it. It was beautiful, and it was also 11 miles of hard walking, and it had come down fast, which meant there'd be more, I said, without quite meaning to. The pass might not be open for another 2 days. Silence behind me. Is that right? She said. Not a question exactly. Might be 3, I said. Another silence. Then she said I can cook. I noticed, I said. And I'm not going to be a bother. You haven't been yet. She was quiet a moment, then, what do you do all day? Check the line. Split wood. Tan hides. Mend gear. Can I help with any of it? I turned around. She was sitting straight-backed with the coffee cup in both hands, watching me with that level look. She wasn't asking permission exactly. She was asking whether she'd be in the way. There's a difference. You can help with the wood, I said. She could split wood. I don't know where she learned. She said her older brother back in Iowa, before her family moved west. But she had the right motion, the way she read the grain before she swung. Not fast. Precise. We worked the woodpile for 2 hours, and then I brought her out on the line with me, more because she'd asked than because I needed the help, and she walked it without complaint, and watched everything, and asked questions. Good questions. Not, why do you do this? But how do you know here? And what does this one tell you? She was curious the way useful people are curious, not performing it. On the way back, she went quiet for a stretch, and then she said, I keep thinking he's going to come after me. I said, Vance? He'll be humiliated, she said. A man like that doesn't take humiliation well. I didn't say. Nobody comes through the pass in 3 feet of snow to chase a woman. I didn't say that because I thought about Colbert Vance, a man who owns most of a county and smells like bay rum and whiskey. And I thought maybe I didn't know. I said, he'd have to get through the pass, she said, like I said. I looked at her. She wasn't afraid exactly. She was watching the tree line with that steady look, accounting for it. Like a thing she was prepared to deal with when it came. That night, I cleaned and oiled the Winchester and set it near the door where I could get to it, and she saw me do it, and she didn't say anything about, told me something. The snow kept coming. 3 days, then 4. I had not had another person in this cabin for more than an afternoon in 4 years. The last had been Harlan Cree, ran the trading post at Widow's Creek, who came by once to shelter from a storm, and stayed one night and talked too much and left me exhausted. Before that, I couldn't remember. Nora was not like that. She had a quality of quiet that didn't press on you. She could be in the same room for 3 hours, and you'd barely feel it, and then she'd say something. And it landed because she'd been thinking it through. She read from the 2 books I had, a surveyor's manual and an account of the fur trade in the Northwest Territories, and she found both of them interesting, which told me something about her mind. She mended 3 of my shirts without being asked, using a needle and thread she'd found in the wooden box by the stove, where I kept such things. I noticed them hung on the line above the stove, and I didn't say anything about it, and she didn't make a point of it. On the 4th evening, she asked me about Missouri. I didn't answer right away. She waited. She was good at waiting. Told her a small piece of it, not all of it. I told her about my brother's land that I'd worked alongside him for 6 years, and the disagreement we'd had that ended it, and how I'd come north. I didn't tell her what the disagreement was about. She didn't push. She said, "You've been up here alone a long time." "Yep," I said. "By choice," she said. Not an accusation. More like she was sorting something. "By choice," I said. "And by the way things went." She nodded once. I looked at the fire, she said. "I think you're a good man, Walt." I looked at her. She was looking at the fire, not at me. Saying it plain, the way she said things, not making more of it than it was. "I think you're steady and you're decent and you know what you're doing, and you don't waste your words. Been here 4 days and I haven't seen a single mean thing in you." 4 days isn't long, I said. "I know it isn't," she said. "Telling you what I see." I didn't know what to do with that. I turned it over. I thought about the ways I might deflect it, and none of them seemed worth the trouble. I said, "There's not a lot of people who'd have said so." She looked at me then. Then they weren't looking. On the 5th day, the snow stopped and the sky came back, particular blue you only get in the mountains after a storm, and I went out to check the pass. It wasn't open. It wouldn't be for another day, maybe 2, but it was getting there. The ice on the Blackthorn had sealed over hard, thick enough to cross by now, if you went upstream to the wider shelf. I stood at the edge of the tree line and looked at the mountains for a while. I am not a man who feels things quickly. Things land on me slow. That's always been my way. Something happens and I don't know what I think about it. Weak. And then one morning I know. Standing there in the cold looking at the mountains I knew. I didn't want her to go. Not the way a man wants company after a long winter. I've wanted that. And I know what it feels like. And this was not that. This was specific. Hands working my frozen fingers back to life. Her weight on the line when she stopped to look at a set track and ask how old. Her. In the bunk across the dark reading the Northwest Territories by the stove light. The shape of her sitting across from me. The things she said. And the longer things she didn't say. Nora. I went back to the cabin and she had coffee on and she looked at me when I came in. The door. Pass, she said. Day maybe two, I said. She nodded and handed me the coffee. I stood there with it. She turned back to the stove. I said, I have to ask you something. She turned. I said, what you're going to do, Millhaven, the school, whatever it is that what you want? Not what you're running to instead of something else. What you actually want. She considered me. I want a life that's mine, she said. I don't want a life that's payment on someone else's debt. That's what you're running from, I said. I'm asking what you want. She was quiet a moment. I want to be somewhere that's honest, she said slowly. Work that matters. I want to sit at the end of a day and feel like I earned it. She paused. I want someone who sees me. Not an arrangement, not a settlement. Someone who actually looks. I stood there with the coffee. She looked at me. I looked at her. I said, I see you. She didn't say anything. The stove ticked. The light was early morning, low and flat, and it came through the one east window and fell across the floor between us. I said, I know we've been 5 days in a snowstorm, and that's not a long time to know a thing. I know that. I stopped, started again. I'm 43 years old. And I have never in my life said anything like what I'm about to say to another person, so I'm just going to say it plain. I stopped again. Then stay here, be my wife. She looked at me for a long moment, she said. Serious? I don't joke, I said. The corner of her mouth moved, not quite a smile. I noticed that, she said. I'm not Colbert Vance, I said. I don't have a county, or a banknote, or a good suit. What I have is this cabin and the line and enough to eat, and I work honest, and I don't drink mean, and I don't have a mean bone that I know of. Though you've only had 5 days to look. But I think, I stopped. I think I could make you a life that's yours, if you wanted it to be. She looked at me for a long time. Then she stepped forward across the floor, and she put her hand against the side of my face. Just her palm, flat and steady against my jaw. And she looked at me from close, and her eyes were steady and certain. She said, I pulled you out of that river. You did, I said. I pulled you out because I couldn't just leave you there, she said. That's the truth of it. I wasn't being heroic. Leave you. She held my face. I've been sitting with that for 5 days wondering what it means, and I think it means something. My hand over hers, against my jaw. Her hand was warm. Say yes, I said. She looked at me. I looked at her. Yes, she said. We didn't go to Corbin's Landing the next day when the pass cleared. We went the day after, and we went together, and we found the circuit preacher at Corbin's, which I hadn't expected. And Nora looked at him and looked at me and said, well, that's convenient. And Cy said it was. And we were married that afternoon, in the front room of the trading post, with Harlan Cree and his wife as witnesses. She wore the gray and mud remains of the white dress. She had brushed it and tried to set the tear in the shoulder as best she could. She stood up straight in it, and she didn't look like a woman in a ruined dress. She looked like herself. I am not going to say what I felt. Some things belong to a man in the moment. We went back to the cabin. We've been back to the cabin most days since. Colbert Vance sent 2 men in the spring. I knew they were coming. I'd asked around at Corbin's Landing, and Harlan had heard it from a freighter who'd come from Grattan. And they came on a Tuesday in March, and they sat their horses at the edge of the tree line and looked at the cabin, and I was in the doorway with the Winchester, and I wasn't in a hurry. They sat there for about a minute. One of them called out, said they were looking for a woman named Nora Pruitt. I said there wasn't anyone by that name here. Nora was behind me, just out of sight, and when I said it, she put her hand flat on my back, one time, and left it there. The man on the horse looked at me for a while. I looked back. He said they'd been told she was up this way. I said he was misinformed. He sat there another 20 seconds. Then the 2 of them turned their horses around and rode back the way they came. I watched until they cleared the tree line. Then I turned. She was standing there with her hand still half raised where it had been on my back, watching me. I looked at her. She said, "Nora Decker." "That's right," I said. We went inside. Shh. There's something I don't know how to put into words, and I've tried. A man my age. A man who spent the better part of his life alone and believed it was probably what he'd earned, and left it at that. There is nothing that prepares you for someone seeing you plain. Not performing seeing you. Just looking. And finding that what's there is enough. Is more than enough. She pulled me out of that river before she knew a thing about me. Just because she couldn't leave me there. I have thought about that a great deal. I split wood in the mornings, and she has taken over the tanning. She learned faster than I did, and does better than I do, and doesn't make a point of it. We walk the line together most days. She taught at the school in Corbin's Landing 2 days a week through the fall, and she liked it, and the children liked her, and I rode out to meet her, each time on the way back, which she pretended to find unnecessary and which she was glad of, I could tell. Evenings we sit by the stove, she reads. I mend gear, or I just sit. Once, maybe 3 months in, she looked up from the book and looked at me across the fire, and she didn't say anything. Just looked the way she does, level certain, with that steadiness she has in her eyes. I looked back. Some things don't need to be said. That was one of them. The mountains outside are the same mountains. The cabin still leaks in 2 places. The line still needs walking. None of that changed. Everything else did.